to find Richard Wagner placed within this European and international context. This is really a compliment to the dramaturgy of the conference, because in my paper I want to show in how far this kind of internationalization was regarded by the late Wagner in his late philosophical work as a dangerous thing, and having his anti-modern attitudes, he also identified modernity as Jewish at a certain point of his life, with a well-known fatal consequence for German history. For Richard Wagner, developing the concept of a national theater was closely related to the compensation of a traumatic personal and political experience. This development was rooted in Zurich, where Wagner had fled to after being sought on warrant throughout Germany because of his active engagement in the Dresden uprising of May 1849. Here he lived, devoid of his income, but also of the unbeloved Royal Saxon court conductor's uniform, which was common at that time, and due to his escape, separated, even if not entirely against his will, from his first wife, Minna, her illegitimate daughter, Natalie, whom he had adopted, as well as from their enervating pet, a parrot named Papo, solely of his patrons. This is just the famous document where it's shown that Richard Wagner, the conductor of the Dresden Opera House, is wanted. At this artistic low point of his life, Wagner took stock of his artistic and historico-political experiences in the liberal movement up to this point by writing the notorious Zurich essays on art and Revolution from 1849, the Artwork of the Future from 1849, and Opera and Drama from 1850 to 51. In these, the author also reassured himself on the unabated necessity of his own political and aesthetic ideas, the intellectual scope of which is able to sublimate the impossibility of its contemporary realization. I quote from Art and Revolution in a moment. In Art and Revolution, the imagined borders of a nation do not suffice to encompass Wagner's vision of a future theater within a society freed from an absolutist regime. In this essay, the author at first verbosely goes all the way back to the prehistoric phase of mankind in ancient Greece in order to legitimize his ideals of art and society based on a three-stage historico-philosophical concept. Wagner begins his discourse with the ideal state of the past, which, according to him, is the ancient Greek polis. In his opinion, this was where the individuals and the state's interests were in accordance with one another and where individual and public consciousness coincided. Thus, to him, the public art of the Greeks, which reached its zenith in their tragedy, was the expression of the deepest and the noblest principles of the people's consciousness. According to Wagner, visiting the theater under such ideal circumstances became a public affair. Now the quote. This people, the Greeks, streaming in its thousands from the state assembly, from the agora, from land, from sea, from camps, from distant parts, filled with its 30,000 heads, the amphitheater. To see the most pregnant of all tragedies, the Prometheus, came they. In this titanic masterpiece, to see the image of themselves, to read the riddle of their own actions, to fuse their own being and their own communion with that of their God, and thus, in noble, stillest peace, to live again the life which a brief space of time before they had lived in restless activity and accentuated individuality. End quote. Wagner's theory stated that when confronted with the scenes in tragedy, an audience member was likely to perceive them as if they were dealing with his personal matters. Quote, for in the tragedy he found himself again, found the noblest part of his own nature united with the noblest characteristics of the whole nation. End quote. The people's ability to identify with the work of art, aligning individual with public consciousness, is rooted in the aesthetic constitution of the entire society of the free and lovely public life of the Greek state, as Wagner calls it. This free and lovely public life is the socio-political foundation for any feasible perfect work of art, which to Wagner is the Greek tragedy. Furthermore, another anthropological conditio sine qua non of it lies in the ancient Greek man's holism, which to Wagner consists in the unification of the physical man with the emotional man and the intellectual man. Thus, in tragedy, which connects the art of dance, the art of tone, and the poetic art as the three chief artistic faculties of the entire man, just like three primeval sisters with one another in an inseparable entity, in Wagner's opinion, the whole man manifests. According to Wagner's ideal conception, the state of the ancient Greek polis is therefore based on the harmony of man as an individual and as a species, as well as on the free development of the complete man, and in this constitution embodies, as it were, the foundation for a perfect work of art, which accordingly is the perfect expression of both the individual and the public consciousness, as well as the expression of the whole man. Only a work of art of that kind, according to Wagner's philosophy of history, enables each of the individual art forms to unfold their respective highest faculty in just this inseparable entity which is attributed to it. As if it were a triad consisting of Wagner's personal current situation as an artist, the analysis of its historical coming into being, reaching far back into ancient Greece, and the deduction of a visionary future from this historical depth, Wagner intonates as a term for this highest work of art, which he finds put into practice in the Greek tragedy by means of the unification of the three mentioned aspects, the full-fledged, as he says it, the full-fledged work of art, the tragedy. Wagner then thinks of the further course of history originating from the ideal polis state of ancient Greece and its arts, which he considers sublime, as a history of decay of its fundamental interrelated sociopolitical, anthropological, and aesthetic components. Given the growing nationalization and increasing privatization, labor division and specialization of the individual, Wagner, in the second step of this three-stage concept of history, sees a historical process taking effect which does not only determine the dissolution of the Greek polis and the tragedy at its aesthetic equivalent, but moreover disables the characteristic unification of the individual arts as an expression of the whole man for centuries to come. I quote from Art and Revolution. Hand in hand with the dissolution of the Athenian state marched the downfall of tragedy. As the spirit of community split itself along 1,000 lines of egoistic cleavage, so was the great united work of tragedy disintegrated into its individual factors. Above the ruins of tragic art was heard the cry of the mad laughter of Aristophanes, the maker of comedies, and at the bitter end, every impulse of art stood still before philosophy, who read with gloomy mien her homilies upon the fleeting stay of human strength and beauty. End quote. The process of particularization, which began with the dissolution of the Greek polis, grows stronger throughout the following epochs, and to Wagner culminates in his contemporary phase of mankind, in which the individual and the nation unshrivenly confront each other, while the whole man is torn apart into the physical, emotional, and intellectual man, and the individual art forms, in accordance with the social egoism, pursue their own development, I quote, in lonely self-sufficiency, end quote. In the industrial society of Wagner's contemporaries, the specialized man merely served, quote, as a tool of these despotic abstract powers, and not by virtue of his manhood, and art was only a commodity. Quote from Art and Revolution. This is art, as it now fills the entire civilized world. Its true essence is industry, its ethical aim the gaining of gold, its aesthetic purpose the entertainment of those whose time hangs heavily on their hands. From the heart of our modern society, from the golden calf of wholesale speculation, stalled at the meeting of its crossroads, our art sucks forth its life juice, borrows a hollow grace from the lifeless relics of the chivalric conventions of medieval times, and blushing not to fleece the poor for all its professions of Christianity, descends to the depth of the proletariat, enervating, demoralizing, and dehumanizing everything on which it sheds its venom. As to future options of leading art and society out of this situation, which is equally hopeless for both, in the third step of his philosophy of history, Wagner developed two different approaches. Approach 1. A revolution will restore the socio-political conditions for an aesthetic public necessary for both the state and the arts. Quote, "The perfect artwork, the great united utterance of a free and lovely public life, the drama, tragedy, is not yet born again, for reason that it cannot be reborn, but must be born anew. Only the great revolution of mankind, whose beginnings erstwhile shattered Grecian tragedy, can win for us this artwork." End quote. However, Wagner only has a vague idea of this forthcoming revolution of mankind. The ideal state of the future, of course, could not be based on a slaveholding society, as the Greek polis had been. Greek citizens had only been able to uncontradictedly conciliate the life of the individual with the interests of the community by keeping slaves, to whom they had assigned domestic and private tasks in order to keep their minds free for political and aesthetic public purposes. But the institution of slavery had become, quote, "the fateful hinge of the whole destiny of the world, the sin of history," according to Wagner, against human nature, which in the long run had led to all men being slaves within Wagner's contemporary society. Wagner goes as far as to depict his vision of a totally technologized and actually quite present-day society in order to save this concept of the ideal state of the future, in which people, after having been freed from, quote, "the dishonoring slave yoke of universal journeymanhood into the free manhood of art, will not entrust the care for their material existence to a slave anymore, but instead to a machine," quote, "the artificial slaves of free creative men," and thereby be enabled to lead a life of science and art. However, Wagner has no idea how to circumvent the economic laws of the production and exchange of commodities, as well as the individual's accumulation of capital. Moreover, in his present situation, he lacks any proof of evidence whatsoever for the early arrival of this revolution of mankind. On the contrary, the hopelessness of his assessment of reality during his exile in Zurich, this is the Wagner couple with another pet, is based on how just this had failed in the specific political reality of the suppression of the Dresden uprising. In line with the paradoxical figure of thought with which before him Schiller and Hölderlin, the famous German poets, had already repressed their discipline at the very low point of his own art's inconvertibility, hypostasizes a revolutionary art as the second possible way out of the unfortunate historical process of decay, which he himself had detected. Consequently, there is approach 2, the positing of an aesthetic public and the retrieval of the lost totality of man by means of programmatic unification of the separate individual arts in the revolutionary work of art. Different from a sort of revolution which would bring about a society, as it were, from the substructure of the relations of production towards an aesthetic reorganization of the state by means of a cultural superstructure with which this reshaping would correspond, revolutionary art is meant to begin in the sphere of cultural life and change society from there. On a social level, the resulting unification of the individual arts necessarily will lead to the formation of a creative community which is supposed to gradually develop into an ideal state which is solely directed towards a common creative process in which the interests of the individual come to consensus with those of the community and which does not allow for the individual's holistic development, but virtually requires it. On such a change in socio-political reality has taken place, once this has taken place, the formerly revolutionary art, which exists, quote, opposed to the ruling spirit of the community, will be conservative afresh, because then it will be like Greek art in its prosperity and restored again, quote, because it was worthy and adequate expression of the public. Wagner's biographer Martin Gregor-Dellien dismissed this second path of thought of Wagner's towards communism as an extravagant idea, which had nothing in common with the Marxist idea of classless society, but instead could be interpreted as a kind of elitist socialism, I quote from translation Martin Gregor-Dellien, as a society of equals among whom intellectuals and artists always are a bit more equal, end quote. Previous research has suspected Wagner, and to a certain extent probably justifiably, of only ever having had an art revolution in mind and of systematically having sought affiliations wherever he could hope for support for his ambitions, theater aspirations. According to an alternative interpretation, Wagner puts forward a socio-political utopia in the tradition of Plato's and Schiller's visions of an ideal state, which must be explicitly differentiated from his later aesthetic of the artwork. At the same time, Wagner's assertions might refer to a cosmopolitan, in the truest sense of the word, concept of theater, and I mean the early Wagner of 1849, extending well beyond the limits of a national context, which he further specifies in his second Zurich essay as the artwork of the future. Just like the ancient Greek artwork of the tragedy, it includes an aesthetic as well as an anthropological and socio-political dimension. Quote, "The great united artwork, which must gather up each branch of art to use it as a mean, and in some sense to undo it for the common aim of all, for the unconditioned absolute portrayal of perfected human nature, this united artwork he, the artist, cannot picture as depending on the arbitrary purpose of some human unit, but can only conceive it as the instinctive and associate product of the manhood of the future." End quote. The first interpretation seems to make sense, considering that while he elaborated on this concept of theater, the utopian dimension, which undoubtedly contains the features of a discourse of suppression which serve to compensate for the impossibility of his own socio-political ideas and his personal standards, gradually caught up with Wagner throughout the course of the second essay down to the much more comprehensible level of the performance of a musical drama as a cultural event. So my idea is that he is simply losing, during the course of his rhetorics and his ideas, this cosmopolitan idea of the future work of art, which does not exist within the traditional framework of a romantic artwork, but is a kind of reformulation of the utopia of a Platonian state. Now he changes his mind a first time and says now, for one can regard, for only the drama can be considered as the highest common artwork intended to restore the holism of man. Because of Wagner, it is the only art from addressing a common public by means of an essential and direct message. It is able to unfold the latter effect specially diversely and extensively if, quote, each separate art can only bear its utmost secret to their common public through a mutual parleying with the other arts. For the purpose of each separate branch of art can only be fully attained by the reciprocal agreement and cooperation of all the branches in their common message. And that means in form of a musical drama. Here you can see that his first ideas, his former ideas, are growing smaller and smaller during the course of his Zurich essays. In the course of theorizing its performance practice, Wagner portrays the socio-political dimension of the Gesamtkunstwerk on the level of a cooperative association of the artists producing it, who, as a free artistic fellowship, resembling the contemporary model of socialist communitarization and deliberately rejecting conventional theater structures of the 1850s due to their system of repertoire, virtuosity, and star cult, is meant to focus entirely on the complementary and free development of the concept of the musical oeuvre, given the mutual completion of individual creative skills resulting in the performance. Now we are presented with the Wagnerian thought that his first Utopia is growing smaller and smaller into, and this we have learned from Udo Bernbach, who is with us, it grows into a cooperative association of the artists. So now I will make a small jump to keep in time. You can be sure that everything is written elaborately, but this special idea of the artistic cooperative changes. First step, I think you all know this, requires a new attitude of reception in the public. Collection and participation, Wagner writes, are required instead of distraction and gladsome occupation, entertainment of contemporary public. The second step and the consequence of this, to totally reformulate the contemporary concept of a spectator, forces him to develop concepts of festivals at remote, you can say at remote anti-metropolitan places, non-urban places where the audience has to develop those changed attitudes towards his work. And now I will come to the late Wagner and a somehow overshadowed festival concept with regard to his Meistersinger production he planned to take place in Nuremberg. With regard to Wagner's point of view concerning the concept of the national theater and its aforementioned compensatory dimension, it's strongly significant given the delicate shift in the political balance of power which resulted from the fact that Prussia, acting under Bismarck's influence, had ventured out of the German Confederation, its increasingly aggressive power politics against Austria, as well as its concomitant claim to the hegemonic role within the German patchwork nation, which was held together only with the greatest effort by means of federal alliances. It is now significant with regard to my leading question that in 1866 Wagner presented a further concept on festivals, because those we already know, Munich, Zurich, be him like Siemens, be it the other way around, we spoke about that yesterday. Wagner presented a further concept of festivals for a short while. Wagner harbored the illusion that the Prussian advance could be opposed if Ludwig II of Bavaria were to assume leadership of the German Confederation, as well as the option hoped for by Wagner, namely a German federal state sustained by equal founding terms. I quote, "Germany's fate lies in the hands of Bavaria alone to determine and to lend European state politics a completely new term," as Wagner stated in a political program which he put together exclusively for the Bavarian king in June 1866. He advised him to retain his own independent politics in order to preserve the German Confederation abandoned by Prussia and Austria. Then Wagner proposed Nuremberg as the future gathering place of the princes of the German Union, with the exception of the sovereigns of Prussia and Austria, and planned to conclude the German federal treaty there, which was supposed to form the basis for any further expansion of this union. And it is in view of Nuremberg as the future government of the German Federation and as residence of the Bavarian monarch, in accordance with the aforesaid political plan created under the apparent order of the day, that a little over a year later, Wagner reformulated the concept on the performance of his musical dramas in the context of a festival, once again in his tractate German Art and German Politics, which he began to write in September 1867. In it, he once again tries to convey the legitimation of his artistic endeavors beyond the common capitalistic purposes and interests, and the necessarily resulting requirement of a broad, socially established patronage, making apparent that his ideas on art converge with his ideas on politics. Hence, Wagner sees the ideal, I quote, of the extraordinary exempted production guaranteed solely under the conditions of the to-date utopian social system of a monarchic republic. Such a society is in itself, in Wagner's political thought, the condition for the possibility of a utopia superior to the existing social order of the state. The state, whose sublimation Wagner had so often called for, is seen as the material basis for any ideal institution which cannot be achieved without the products of modern civilization. But, according to Wagner, now the state is the, quote, representative of absolute utility, which by necessity repels, quote, whatever cannot demonstrate an immediate utilitarian purpose. For these reasons, Wagner assesses his earlier goal, quote, to desire to claim the state directly for art, as an error. For these reasons, Wagner assesses his earlier goal to desire to claim the state directly for art, this was a quote, as an error. Wagner viewed the utopia of creating an aristocratic order as an artistic, intellectual, priestly caste, as a future possibility for achieving this aim. By means of an ideal kingship, one might achieve the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, since Wagner derives the idea of an order at the top of society from the exceptionality that is, quote, the right of royal grace as the model of the king's effectiveness wielded in and over the state. Here Wagner has the creation of an actual body of order as one, quote, legislative body exempted by means of the order's requisite sacrificing of the common laws of utility in mind. Above all others, the nobility should belong to this class or estate of the exempted by means of its traditional ethos of noblesse that excludes any labor. That means the contemporary restorative energies of this nobility should be concentrated in an activity which, quote, directs itself at such superior aims that must remain distant from the tendency towards the purely bourgeois and even state bureaucracy, giving up their bourgeois privileges and providing the material possessions for the higher ideal task of society. According to Wagner, the aristocrats called to the order of the priests of art should concentrate the education which their noble way of life has provided for them in order to prepare an aesthetic public sphere which raises itself above a world of constraints and utility. Thus, in order to realize the total work of art, the aristocracy has to be aesthetically reconfigured, thus promoting a monarchy of the people, especially in the sense of being the vehicle of Wagner's societal ideal. The king and the class of the exempted shall bring about, via the abolishment of commercial theaters, the performance of the artwork of the future in the entire scope of its socio-politically grounded receptive staging level, and that means, quote, out of the original spirit of the people. Paradoxically, this process has to be led authoritatively from above now. German art and German politics appeared as of September 1867 as a series of articles in the semi-official Süddeutsche Presse. However, the last two articles with their theatrical utopian content were banned in December due to their controversial political impetus. Even if Wagner, in his polemic, did not directly refer to the events in 1866, and when it appeared had in the meantime advised Ludwig II, after the victory of Prussia in the war, caused by the hegemony conflict and ignited by Holstein crisis, as well after the peace treaty of Prague, which strengthened Prussia's position to a diplomatically balanced alliance with Prussia, it is nevertheless significant in the context of this publication that during the heated political phase, Wagner for a short while contemplated Nuremberg as the place for the planned festival and the master singers of Nuremberg as the production to be performed in it. Subsequently, Wagner's political course consisted in advising Ludwig on a careful diplomatic rapprochement with Prussia, retaining a Bavarian Franconian manner, but without any preconditions of political parity or reassurance from Habsburg, this ensuring the bitter opposition of political Catholics as well as the ultramontanists loyal to Austria at that time. Wagner inscribed this political gesture in Hans Sachs' closing speech in the final version of the Mastersingers as well, in which he introduced the warning about Latin trinket and nasty pranks, praise of the masters as well as the mourning over the German prince's alienation from the people. I think you will all know this. This is part of my jump. We can come back to these documents later. This is Hans Sachs at the end of the Mastersingers. These verses were an open affront to the reactionary ultramontanists of Munich's ruling circles. To come to an end and to sum up, that means within the context of the verses for the finale of the originally planned performance at the Nuremberg Festival, which means before Bayreuth, which were written later, it also becomes evident that in the concept Wagner presented in German art and German politics, he underwent a complete transformation from the revolutionary cosmopolitanism of his early work and the ideas of his Zurich essays on the total work of art, and moved toward a nationalism based on autochthony. We yesterday heard by the keynote by Osterhammel that globalization does also unfold through nationalism, but here he uses nationalism as a kind of antidote against the change, the modern change of society. And this nationalism is also a part of an autochthonous attitude. Here, Wagner superimposed actual political tensions and the conflict about the German Empire with the concept of a cultural nation as an imagined community in line with the anthropologist Benedict Anderson. This way, he ultimately withdrew his earlier ideals of an art revolution, thus compensating, yet at the same time suppressing once more, this time, the modern experience of crisis in form of the dissolution of the feudal order and the spreading capitalization, even in the theater, by means of an autochthonous stroke of fortune. And just like he interpreted his protagonist Hans Sachs in his closing speech of the Mastersingers as a vigorous reminder of the political cultural tradition of German art in order to, given the hopelessness of the recent political situation, provide a preliminary design for a future political self-conception of the Germans as a cultural nation, in German art and German politics, his final festival concept, which was written nearly at the same time as the Mastersingers, he created a concept for an autochthonous national theater in order to compensate a modernity which he experienced in a state of crisis. I finish here. The next step is now to identify or to disregard this modernity as Jewish, and it is then the task of the National Socialists to bring together the autochthonous German attitude with the means of modernization with the help of broadcasting companies and all the fatal consequences we know about. But this cannot be counted as an excuse. Thank you.